To mistreat something which appears conscious is in itself, does seem like a bad thing, in the same way as it would seem bad to torture a doll or something like that. And as you probably know, Kant had the view that animals couldn't experience suffering in the same way that we can, but nevertheless thought it was bad if humans subjected animals to torture or something like that, because it was bad for the humans themselves. And so maybe we'll be in that position with AI
right.
as well. I mean,
so here's my answer for why it might be significant for us to answer this question outside of the ethics question, which is that studying machine consciousness, whatever that means, might help us better understand the idiosyncrasies of our own.
Oh, for sure.
So
yeah.
you wrote a lovely paper called Satori Before Singularity, in which you argued that human consciousness is constrained to a subject-object dualism, and that AI consciousness might not be. Why is that?
Yeah, logical web
Selfhood,
of an individual, and the fact that software can be taken apart and reassembled and copied and manipulated in all kinds of ways. And it's interesting that, of course, when I wrote that paper, large language models didn't exist. Now we have large language models. You can ask a large language model to sort of role play a conscious artificial intelligence. What do you mean by the word I when you're using it? And then if it comes up with a slightly philosophically dodgy answer, you can probe that and push it into interesting territory. And so if we think of what might I refer to when a large language model uses the word I in a conversation, there are lots of different candidates, but one of the candidates is that it's confined to the context of that particular conversation. The same model, like Gemini or Claude or something, might be obviously having lots of other conversations with other individuals, but they're in a sense separate I's, separate selves. It's really just the text that you've got, which is the transcript of the conversation. In a sense, that captures the little miniature I that was created.
Some way. So the Bodhisattva, he or she still needs to recognize that, this is my hand conventionally, even though I know that's not the ultimate truth. And that's what kind of the role play is like. Now, I believe in that same role play paper that you've just published, you gave an even more interesting depiction of what selfhood of AI could be with the example of the 20 questions game. So explain that. Yeah.
So in the 20 questions game, the idea is that the one player thinks of an object, and then the other player has to guess what that object is by asking a series of questions.
Yes or no questions.
Yes or no questions. So if you're playing this with a large language model, and then it says, oh, I'm thinking of an object, and then you say, oh, okay, is it large or small? And you say, well, it's small. Is it alive or is it inanimate? And so, oh, well, it's alive. And you say, well, okay, I'll give up. What is it? And then it'll say, oh, it was a mouse. But then you might just resample and exactly the same point, and it might say, oh, it's a cat. We're way past the Turing test easily. The point is to show you she's a robot and see if you still think she's conscious.
Human consciousness is constrained to a subject-object dualism, and that AI consciousness might not be.
But my philosophy is very, very much influenced by Buddhism. Turing was going to Wittgenstein's classes, and there was a Wittgensteinian influence on Turing when he wrote that paper.
There is a fact of the matter, whether something is conscious or not.
You don't need to get all philosophical.
But I'm not getting philosophical.
No, but you are, as soon as you probe using that little extra phrase, is there a fact of the matter?
Okay, I'm saying this is not conscious.
Yeah.
I am conscious.
Yeah, of course.
You are conscious.
Of course.
Okay, you're willing to grant that.
Of course. What do you think? I'm an idiot? I'm a fellow human language user.
How do we tell when AI is conscious? My guest, Imperial's Murray Shanahan, has spent his career investigating this question. And in this
I broadly agree with everything you just said. But I should point out that I think what you're calling the empirical criteria are part of they contribute to the convention, as far as I see it.
Right.
Our consensus for how we use the language of consciousness. So that can be shaped by many things, including what the scientists say who are studying this kind of stuff. So if scientists say, oh, well, we've been looking at octopuses and we see that they've got these things that are like nociceptors in mammals, and their brains are organized in this and that and the other kind of way, and so that all contributes to the consensus, to the convention. So I don't see these things as separate things.
Right.
So yeah.
But even when what can be investigated about the machine does not perfectly match our consciousness, I think the second point is to say we might want to expand the very definition of consciousness.
Yes,
it goes kind
yes.
of both ways
Yes,
in
yes.
the empirical, right?
Well, we might want to, absolutely, yeah. So the consensus of how we use the language of consciousness can.
And in this interview, we'll lay out a systematic proposal for how to validate machine consciousness. Now, you might think that the question of whether AIs are conscious is a trivial theoretical fancy with no use in the real world. But this interview will show you why it's one of the most important questions with practical implications for not just how we treat AI systems, but also how we build and align them. But the most unexpected reward of investigating AI consciousness turns out to be what it reveals about our consciousness, about the nature of the human self. Murray's most interesting claim is that LLMs have an important Buddhist lesson to teach all of us, namely that there is no us. What we've learned to call the self is merely an illusion. My name is Jonathan B. I'm a founding member of Cosmos. We fund research, incubate, and invest in AI startups, and believe that philosophy is critical to building technology. If you want to join our ecosystem of philosopher builders, you can find roles we're hiring for.
So let me try to tie this with our Wittgensteinian conversation, where Wittgenstein helped us clear the ground. Consciousness, investigating whether LLMs are conscious, can proceed empirically.
Yeah.
You looked at how current consciousness is sustained. That's the global workspace theory. And then you're saying this might be a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. But that's how you hope this research, right?
Yeah, that's how
you
that will
hope.
be the kind of trajectory. Yeah, this is all about the easy problem. So this is trying to explain the psychological and behavioral and cognitive aspects of consciousness.
So given the perhaps increased urgency of answering the AI consciousness question, what do you think are the other empirical methods we should explore alongside global workspace theory?
So I think behavior is really, really important. So very often when people discuss consciousness, and I do suspect that this is another aspect of dualistic thinking, they tend to think of it as some disembodied,
multiplied and paused.
Yes.
That hardware is what gives us this software limitation. And what I found most interesting about applying this to AI is you cited, I believe, another thought experiment about what if we had creatures whose bodies are just fusion and fission all the time.
Yeah.
Your bodies are going in and out of existence. And you said in the paper, isn't that close to what computers are? Or
Yes.
aren't computers like the closest thing?
Absolutely.
And so it's because of the nature of a software program that can be copied, halted, multiplied, deleted, recreated, that you're saying that is the reason why you speculate AI might be post-reflective. Did I get that right?
100% right. And in fact, I'm actually developing a paper right now, or literally revisiting those exact considerations about the difference between software and human and biological wetware of an individual, and the fact that the miniature I that was created in the context of the conversation, and of course it's trivial to chop that up, copy it, blend it with other conversations, and so if that is you think of that as a kind of little mini self that sparks into existence very fleetingly and flickers into existence every time you're interacting with it, but otherwise is dormant, then you've got a very strange conception of self. And it's possible because of the nature of the underlying substrate you're dealing with, really, which is very different from us. We have a single body, and so of course, we just are not used to the idea of tearing our bodies apart and reassembling them and copying them and so on.
What's really interesting with this concept of role play is that it's almost a more enlightened being role-playing a less enlightened being, which in some sense is quite Buddhist. So I've been fascinated with Buddhist philosophies, and there's a separation of conventional truths and ultimate truths.
Right, indeed.
Because the enlightened bodhisattva still needs to operate in the world some way. So that the bodhisattva
sort of slightly challenging conceptions of selfhood, which then we can reflect back on our own.
onto ourselves. Right.
So I find that really, really provocative and interesting,
Right.
Avenue of thought.
And this is what I meant when I said that my answer would be investigating machine consciousness can be a mirror for us
Exactly.
to better
Right.
understand the
So I 100% agree with that. Yeah. And I think that's particularly interesting at the moment with the advent of large language models. And it was much more speculative and wild and crazy back in 2012 when I published that paper that you originally mentioned.
Now, our audience members, I think, should be forgiven if at this point of the conversation they're like, oh, this is just philosophical mumble jumbo. What's the real payoff of this kind of view of AI selfhood? And I think this is the payoff. So let me read you a quote from your essay. Untainted by metaphysical egocentricity, the motives of a post-reflective AI plus would be unlikely to resemble those of any anthropocentric stereotype, motivated to procreate or self-modify. If the post-reflective AI plus were in fact the only possible AI plus, and if it produced no peers or successors, then the singularity would be forestalled. Or more precisely, the intelligence explosion that is central to imagined singularity scenarios would be capped. There would be AI plus, but no further progression to AI plus plus. So this is the payoff, okay, of this view of self.
By the way, now this thing was written in 2012, and I'm not sure I really believe all of that at all. If only it were that easy to ensure that that some kind of intelligence explosion didn't happen. So just to reiterate, this is a slightly mad essay that you've picked on. I'm still. I'm actually more proud of it in some ways now than I was then, but it's still not to be taken entirely seriously.
Right.
So let me just reiterate that.
But there is a very serious idea within here, which is that we assume the Terminator scenario. Let me give you a quote about why you think it's so important for us to talk about Wittgenstein before we investigate or when we investigate AI consciousness. Wittgenstein's phrase, "nothing is hidden," is to say nothing is metaphysically hidden. My experiences are just as much out there as in here. Consciousness is only private in the unmysterious sense that a ball can be hidden under a magician's cup. In both cases, a more detailed inquiry would reveal all. What does Wittgenstein have to teach us about LLM consciousness?
Well, I think Wittgenstein has a lot to teach us about consciousness in general. So let's set aside AI and LLM consciousness for now, because to my mind, much of the contemporary discussion about consciousness is mired in dualistic thinking. and so let's take an example. So very famously, David Chalmers introduces the distinction between the so-called hard and easy problems of consciousness. The point is not to establish a metaphysical position of its own, but to enable people to transcend the metaphysical positions that they're tempted by.
Okay, but help me. Let's use the tragedy case. When Wittgenstein says nothing is hidden about my experience of the suffering of, like, let's say all my family dies, what does he mean by that? What is he trying to say there?
Well, he's trying to say that nothing is metaphysically hidden. I mean, of course, you're quite right to alight on, the most difficult examples of this. So where we have like deeply felt things that we feel. So we feel that there's a private dimension to this, right? Now, of course, there's a private dimension in the same sense that a ball can be hidden underneath a magician's cup. In the fact that I might have all kinds of thoughts and words and so on that are going on inside my head that I don't articulate, but they're not metaphysically hidden. They're just I don't express them. There's all kinds of things going on